right, according to the factory service manual, installation should be pretty straightforward. We just need to lubricate this a little bit and use a nice soft hammer to tap it in. Easy peasy. Nothing like some good old axle grease. That's what I usually call it, but it's not really axle grease now, is it? That ball joint's permanently sealed, by the way, so. And I don't guess if this thing here has a top or bottom. You just... All right, here we go. Let's see if we can't get this thing in here. There we go. Just had to man up on it a little bit. I believe that's about got it. All right, let's go get our cover and bolt it on. Yeah, we got a nice little coat of paint on there. Let's get our hardware out here. Nice. There goes my washer. Come on back here. Long bolts, nuts, and washers go together, and the two short ones go together. Let's see, we've got to get our rubber piece installed. See if we can't get that in there. Little persuasion juice there. Going to get that little rubber nub through the hole there. All right, done. That's good enough. So it looks like we're going to have to tighten down put in our long ones first, and then tighten it down. I'm going to tell you what, this is just weird. This is a really weird piece of machinery. I don't know what they were thinking when they came up with this, but I think they were smoking some stuff when they came up with this thing. I think they were hoping cannabis would be legalized early. So, we'll just get that one started like that. And then we'll get the other one started like that. We're going to set our impact to low. All right, we're going to have to... It's aluminum, so you don't want to get it too tight, folks. Are you guys ready for the reveal? Let's see what we have here. Well, all right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A fully restored braking support bracket for a W126 driver's side. 2 new bushings and 1 new ball joint. Also a fresh coat of paint. Looks nice, doesn't it? Before too long, we'll put this on the car, but for right now, we're going to move on to something else. All right, let's go ahead and get the upper control arm installed on the car. Before we start doing that, I want to talk about one common problem with these W126 cars. So the end of the sway bar or torsion bar, whatever you want to call it, this thing right here it's prone to rust. If it gets too rusty, the center of this thing is bored out. There's a hole in here, right? And with threads in it. There's a bolt that goes in here, and that's what holds everything together. So if this thing gets too bad in a salty environment, this thing can just snap right off, and then you're in a serious situation with your suspension system. This is kind of a poor design. These S-Class cars are great cars, but there's a few things on them that are over-engineered, and they're just not very good design. So these things, if they're too rusty, they're prone to break off. And you can see that mine has got some pitting. So this car has some pitting, but it's not bad. It's still nice and strong. I just wanted to point that out. All right, so let's move on, shall we? And let's go ahead and get this upper control arm installed. Got a couple of bushings. I got these in from Rhine. AVP 0248R is the part number. They go on the end of the torsion bar, and you have to put the control arm over the end of the torsion bar before you can nestle it in place at its pivot point on the car. So we've got to get these bushings squared away. All right, I'm back. I had to go get all of my hardware together, and then I had to clean it up with the die grinder. You've got 3 washers and a bolt and 2 bushings. First we have a washer, then the bushing goes on, and then the control arm. There we go. I think that needs some gentle persuasion. That's a tight fit. All right, so before I go any further, I've got to line up the rear of the control arm with the hole in the car and get the bolt through there. And then I'll go ahead and attach this end of the control arm to the torsion bar. So we have determined that the upper control arm bolt is a 12 millimeter diameter at a 1.5 pitch. Anytime you're working on an old car, you always want to chase the threads on your fasteners in the bolts and the nuts, because, you know, if the stuff won't go back together, there you are, you got to take it all apart again. So if I spend 2 or 3 minutes chasing the threads on this bolt, make sure they're nice and clean, I won't have any problems when I get ready to put this stuff together. All right, a little update on getting this bolt for the upper control arm reinstalled. You can see the bolt down in there. Again, disregard the leaves. Detailing and cleaning will come later after mechanical restoration. So anyway, that bolt, it's really hard to get my hand down in there, right, for obvious reasons. To get it lined up, I went and got a nice blunt end punch, right? I put it in the other side, so I can move this punch in this way, up or down or side to side, while simultaneously having my hand down here, feeling the bolt and wiggling it around, easing it up into the hole. I've got it up in there about 1/2 inch so far. It's far enough now. I think what I can do is I can get my pry bar in and get a little more power with the pry bar against the head of the bolt and try to force it in that way. Okay, so using a variety of means, notably this punch, I was able to fish this in there and move it around, and what you're doing is you're changing the geometry of the back of the control arm this way, or with your hand down here trying to force the bolt that way. You know, it took me a long time, probably 10 or 15 minutes to work that in there. That was quite a job. And then I'll put a nut on that, tighten that down a little bit, and we will finish tightening the upper control arm to the torsion bar. All right, I got the transmission jack out here with a block of wood, and I raised up on the torsion bar to get the end of the torsion bar to align with the hole in the upper control arm. There's tension on the torsion bar from the passenger side because that wheel and the suspension system is still on, right? So the torsion bar was sagging down like this, and I was unable to attach it to the upper control arm. So I jacked it up a little bit, and now we're going to bolt it up. All right, let's go ahead and tighten down the upper control arm. I've already got the bushing installed on the end there. It just slipped right over the end of the torsion bar. The larger washers, okay, go like this. And this indented part goes toward the front of the car. By the same token, the smaller washers the same way. The indentation goes toward the front of the car. And we slip this up here in the bushing, and we tighten her down, and we're going to move on. All right, found the torque settings online. So the bolt back here that mounts the control arm to the car is 80 Newton meters, which is around 60 foot-pounds. The bolt here to the torsion bar is 65 Newton meters, and the one to the ball joint is a mere 40 Newton meters. All right, I've been taking a look at the sway bar bushings on this car. I did a little poking around with a screwdriver gently. They are original to the car, and there's not a thing in the world wrong with them. I did buy 2 new ones, but honestly, I'm not going to mess with it. If I start to hear a clunk later on, and if I see some deterioration, I'll change them out then. But for this job, we're leaving the stock ones alone. Let's move on to something else. Up next, lower control arm with a fresh coat of paint and a new bushing. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Yep, I kind of figured that. The new bushing is a little wider than the old one, so I have to probably offer up some gentle persuasion here. You'll note that the lower control arm bolt has a permanently mounted eccentric on this end, and our mark is right there. So we just have to line that up with the mark that we made on the frame earlier, and we'll be all right. There we go. All right, no need to tighten that down just yet. Next up, we're going to put the braking support mounting bracket up. I'm going to raise the car up a little bit so I can get that a little easier. All right, up next is the braking support bracket. I cleaned up the threads on my bolts with my tap and die set before I started this. All right, I had my impact wrench on low. I just snugged them up a little bit. I'm going to get these bolts here on next. All right, our last 3 bolts here. You want to be careful with these. Remember, you're screwing into an aluminum bracket. These are 17 millimeter. I'm not sure what the torque setting is on those. I'll look it up after a while. We'll get everything torqued down once we're done reassembling all the major pieces. So one thing to note on these Mercedes control arms also, you don't really want to torque down. If you're replacing the bushing in a lower control arm, you want to get your suspension into a normalized setting before you tighten this bolt down on your lower control arm, right? Because you know the Mercedes with the rubber bushings and everything, you don't want to overflex them. So what you want to do is get everything back together, get the car on the ground, or put a jack underneath this and get some compression on your suspension system in a more normalized state, and then tighten this bolt down. That's the proper way to do it. Same thing goes for the upper control arm. You want to get the suspension normalized with the car's weight on the suspension system, and then you want to tighten the upper and lower control arms. Okay, let's go ahead and get the guide rod on next. We'll go ahead and lube up the threads on this ball joint threaded shaft here. I've got to count 2.5 threads, so that's when I need to stop. What you gonna do now, moron? All right, I made a little mistake, and I corrected it off camera. I mistakenly tried to install the lower control arm, then the mounting bracket, and then the guide rod. Well, you can't do that. You can put the lower control arm in first, that's fine, but you have to attach the guide rod to the braking support bracket first. You have to screw this on first, and then take the mounting bracket and the rod and then install it all in one step so that you can insert the end of the guide rod into the lower control arm. No big deal. I just pulled it back down and put it together and bolted it back up. So we're going to tighten up our guide rod now. We're not going to torque it down just yet. I still need to install the fasteners here in the end of the guide rod where they connect to the lower control arm. So we'll do that next. All right, we're going to get our hardware installed in the lower control arm that connects the guide rod. So we've got a couple of rubber coated metal pieces and a bolt and a couple of metal bushings. I'm going to use new rubber pieces, but I'm going to use the original bolt, the aftermarket part that I was looking at. The bolt didn't seem as substantial, and this original Mercedes bolt is really, really heavy duty, and there's nothing wrong with it. I'm going to reuse it. So there's a little notch here in these rubber pieces that goes around the end of the rod. All you got to do is match it up. Not a big deal. All right, let's get that tightened down. 19 millimeter. All right, again, I'm not going to tighten stuff down too tightly. Get the spring in place. Then we'll start torquing everything down. Okay, let's go ahead and get our bottom spring plate on, or support plate, whatever you want to call it. I just snug those up pretty good. They're not going to go anywhere, especially after that spring gets in there. All right, time for the steering knuckle, people. So what you want to do is you want to bend this ball joint shaft outward just a little bit to give yourself room to get it in there. So just what you want to do is you want to put the nut on there like that, just a little bit. Take a pry bar or a screwdriver and bend it outward a little bit. Not bend, but move it outward rather. Otherwise, you can't get it on. So, and these things are pretty stiff, so you can't really manhandle it by hand unless you got really strong hands. But anyway, so here we go. And we'll get the spring in next. You'll note I've got some plastic around the spindle to keep that from getting banged up. All right, just getting a ball joint snugged down just a little bit. There's no need in getting that too tight just yet, so I want to get the spring in there next. All right, I unbolted the upper control arm from the steering knuckle because there's not enough room to get the spring in there. I should have measured it with a tape measure before I started this, but oh well. All right, I'm going to tie that up just for a little safety. The red mark on the spring was facing outwards. That's how I know I have it in the proper orientation. Plus, there's a little recess in the bottom spring plate where the end of the spring sits. You'll be able to feel it. There's a little indentation right there where the end of the coil sits. All right, let's get the coil spring installed and get this suspension system back into a proper setting. So go ahead and lift up. Oh, there we go. Lift up some more. It's going to be... There we go. All right, that was kind of a hassle to film, so I just didn't do it. I had a helper in here with me, so we had to lift up on this just a little bit and get this nut started on the upper control arm. That hard part is done. And once we get the upper control arm nice and tight, we'll go ahead and uncompress our coil spring. All right, so this is 40 Newton meters of torque required, which is about 29 foot-pounds. So we're going to start off at about 20 foot-pounds and work our way up. All right, we got our upper ball joint nice and torqued. We're going to leave the torque on the upper control arm and the lower control arm. We're not going to torque those down until we get ready to normalize the suspension and put it under weight. Well, I'm going to go ahead and torque down the guide rod to the lower control arm now. I don't know what that torque setting is, but I will find out by the time this project is over. So I think I'm going to put it at about 40 or maybe 50 foot-pounds. I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave it right there. 30 is be good enough for right now. All right, I think we are ready to lower the car a little bit and go ahead and put some spring tension on the suspension. So let's do that next. All right, so I can't get a torque wrench here on the lower control arm bolt, so I'm just going to tighten it up and get it really tight, and that'll be good enough. Because this is a self-locking nut, it'll be fine. All right, that's pretty tight. I think that'll be just fine. Let's go ahead and release the pressure on our spring. You have to get to the bolt from the inside the engine bay. But I'll give you a first-class shot of the spring tension being released. All right, I think we're ready to take this out of here. Man, I'm glad that's done. Let's raise the car back up. Okay, everybody, we're going to finish up the rebuild on our W126 front suspension, at least the driver's side anyway. So we're going to replace both tie rod ends, and I'm going to be using Moog. And the reason why I'm using Moog, these can be lubricated, they can be maintained, and they come in the kit with a greasable fitting, obviously a new nut to hold it on. So we're going to count the turns as we remove the old ball joint. 1, 2, 'I didn't quite get to 23 before it fell out. All right, here we go. And you'll note that this, the threads on this one are backwards, right? Because that's the way tie rods are. The threads on this end will be different from the threads on this end, so that the adjustment technician at the alignment shop can just turn the center shaft and either shorten the tie rod or lengthen it. All right, a little grease will make our life a little easier. And I think it's 22.5 turns. So let's get this guy started. All right, I got it started. 1 turn. 2. 20, 21, 22. And we're just going to call it 23. Close enough. All right. The alignment shop can worry about the rest. Okay, let's count. 1. Right at 22. Okay, now for the inner tie rod. This one has normal threads. All right, 22. Good enough. We'll let the alignment shop work out the details. Now let's put our greasable fitting in. And there it is right there. All right, we're going to install our greasable fitting. Seven millimeter. All right, looks good. There's our boot. You'll note that these Moog tie rod ends come with a castle nut and a cotter pin. It works best to start it with a nut driver and then finish it up with a wrench. All right, ready to get this on the car, ladies and gentlemen. All right, let's finish this job up. All right, all we have to do now is tighten down the castle nuts and we'll be done. All right, according to the internet, these take about 26 foot-pounds, but I think as long as we get kind of close, we'll be all right. We're going to get our cotter pins in next. Okay, let's get some grease in these fittings. There we go. Greasable. Greasable. All right, last step, let's get this shock on. All right, this is what we're going to go with. I've got Sachs part number 316943. It's a good OEM shock for Mercedes. You'll note that it comes with a new plastic cover over the top. I'm not going to use that. The original plastic cover that came with this car is still on it. I'm assuming these came from Mercedes branded shock absorbers because it has the little Mercedes emblem on it right there. So, take that off. Put that on. I don't know if that was stock or not, but it's got the Mercedes logo on it, and I'm going to go with that. All right, so continuing on, there's a trick to get these shocks installed, right? So you want to tilt the bottom plate of the shock in this fashion, and so that the shock is angled outward this way, right? And then get your bolt started, and then so that you'll be able to get a socket in there. Once this inside bolt is tightened, you can take the shock, compress it, move it inward, slip it up through the hole, and then tighten the outward bolt. All right, let's tighten down the top of the shock and we'll be done. Okay, for the top, we've got a rubber bushing. We've got a metal washer and 2 nuts. All right, we've got a floor jack underneath here with a block of wood. We've got the suspension raised up just a little bit. Now we can get our nuts on and tighten the shock up. Tighten this down far enough to where the metal washer expands the rubber out to about the width of the metal washer, and then you're done. Now we're going to put the second nut on top to lock everything down. All right, so we've got a 17mm wrench on the bottom nut and a socket on the top one, and we tighten these two against one another. Boom, we're done. Well, all right, everyone, I'm going to call this a video, and I'm going to call it a series. You'll note that the hub, bearings, wheel, and brakes are still not on the car, but that really isn't part of the front suspension rebuild. I'm still waiting on brake parts to arrive in the mail, so I'll do that at a later date. The front suspension rebuild on the driver's side portion of this car, anyway, is done. Okay, we have completely rebuilt the braking support bracket to include 2 new bushings and a ball joint. We have replaced the bushing in the lower control arm. We've replaced the rubber bushings in the guide rod to lower control arm mount. The shock, the upper control arm, which includes an upper ball joint, and new bushings all in one unit. And lastly, a new tie rod with Moog greasable tie rod ends. Well, all right, everyone. This concludes the series on rebuilding the front suspension on our W126 Mercedes. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We'll talk to you later.